Good afternoon, this is Bill Boushka, owner of the site doaskdotell.com, and we just want to talk this afternoon about the future of online speech and particularly user-generated content and the whole idea of broadcasting yourself. We've made speech a reflexive verb. You know how it is in foreign languages, like in French, I think you put the SE in front of something in order to say that you're doing something for yourself, and without the permission of others or without the supervision of others. And that's what we've gotten used to since probably the middle or late 1990s. We've gotten used to the idea we can say what we want online and it can be found anywhere in the world with search engines, except in China maybe, and even then a lot of times you can be found. And that over time that's changed. Gradually, instead of using search engines and simply publishing flat sites, social media has taken over, and of course we had the dot-com boom around 1998, 1999, which busted, and then we had a few big companies survive, and then gradually the big social media companies came in, and then the emphasis was more on having whitelisted lists of friends or followers and communicating mostly with them on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, to a lesser extent Snapchat, because that's ephemeral. And so search engines were less important, but still the idea that you on your own could influence policy, you could influence politics without having anyone else's approval before you went on the air, that's something we've taken for granted and gotten used to. That's coming under attack now, and it's particularly been a problem since the 2016 election, and then since the Charlottesville incident in August of 2017, when a lot of people have become concerned that because of all the instability and all the political polarization, that what's happening is that with all this speech without action to go with it is simply driving people apart and creating resentment, creating more resentment for the people who got left behind, leading to sometimes violent incidents. And so the tech companies have been pulling back in censorship and deplatforming people. They've been very concerned because they're dependent on persistent identifiers and cookies to generate advertising, to generate clicks, because they're so dependent on that. They have pulled back a lot, and gradually people are being knocked offline or knocked off certain platforms, or being demonetized, or can't make a living and so forth. So there are a lot of problems. So what I wanted to do was run through the fact that all of the different problems today, there are a lot of them, and it's not just one problem at a time. One of the problems is that when an issue comes up, like network neutrality, for example, when an issue comes up, and we'll start, here. When an issue comes up, the nonprofits and the various organizations, the advocacy, the activists will try to get you to take action and donate, and they'll always have big donate buttons, and they'll always have big take action buttons. They'll be very bombastic to try to defeat one particular issue, as if the idea was that there was take no prisoners, that you have to stop every single problem before there's another problem. But of course that never works, because we nearly always lose when we try to do that. And I'm going to run through a lot of the different problems this afternoon. There are about 20 of them, and then kind of give you an idea of where I think this is headed in the next year or two, particularly after the 2020 election, as we get into the next term. So let me just run through. Let me run through the most obvious things. First of all, the whole basis for our internet speech back in starting in the middle of the 90s was two laws. The Section 230 of the 1996 Communications Decency Act, which was really the 1966 Telecommunications Act, the Supreme Court struck down the censorship sections of the 1996 Act, but they let stand Section 230, which by and large means that a platform is not liable for most of the torts that a user might commit when using their service, particularly defamation and invasion of privacy. And that has eroded over time, as we'll find out. And there are more erosions of it coming. You know, now there's a big controversy as to whether a platform like YouTube or Facebook is really a publisher or whether it's a platform, and whether it should be protected from downstream liability. Obviously, if you had to check every user post or every blog post or every video before it was allowed to be seen by the public, you couldn't allow everybody to speak. You would have to be more or less like a regular publisher that decides what gets published, like it always was before. Well, how does a publisher decide what gets published? Whether it'll make money, whether people will pay for it. So it was essentially a commercial activity. It wasn't a political activity. It was more, publishing was always intended to serve the need of a consumer or the desire of a consumer. And the idea that you could sell copies of a book means that you're at least sensitive or at least observe, care about the wants and desires of your consumers. You're not just saying what you want to say, you're saying things that they'll pay for, which says you care about people in a philosophical way. That's a very important point. There was also the idea that you could self-publish. There used to be what we call vanity publishing. Today it's called self-publishing, which has become replaced more or less by print on demand, where you pay somebody to publish your book and get it into bookstores, or to get it into Amazon, to get it into other, and so that the rest of the world will find it. And then you to keep all the profits, or keep more of the profits than with a trade publisher. There are problems with that. Right now, publishers, even the POD publishers, the self-publishers, are starting to get more concerned than they used to be over whether books actually sell, because it looks bad if somebody just simply wants to rant about something and be heard by themselves in a climate where there's so much polarization going on. That's starting to look bad. So even they are getting very uncomfortable about that. Furthermore, they have to make a living. Their employees have to make a living, so they actually still need to sell books. So what happened with what happened with Section 230 is you could simply publish things for only the only point being that others would find it, that you wanted to say something. You didn't necessarily have to charge anybody for anything. Now, that was a lot more effective maybe 15 years ago. That was particularly effective from maybe 1998 until maybe 2004, 2005. MySpace came along, but then the other bigger social networking companies came along and started changing the way people use the internet. But in those days, people actually looked up things they were interested in, and with search engines, they would find gays in the military, which is what I wrote about then. They would find the thing I often was one of the people first found with, I had very simple websites. I'll show you the site and come back. But this is the site. This is the site, and you can see I have the blogs on the left side and information about the books on the right side. And while we're here, let me get out the books, just so you can see what they look like. there are this was the first one in 1997 called, Do Ask, Do Tell, a gay conservative lashes back, and that by and large dealt with gays in the military and don't ask, don't tell, and I tied that back to the arguments about the draft and the inequality of who served in the first place. And that argument that I made started to get a lot of traction because I put it online to be read for free, and it started getting a couple 100,000 hits a year, and I started becoming known for having said it. And my own story about being thrown out of college for the same reasons that the military was using then to exclude gays, that back in the late 90s and early 2000s, that had a lot of traction. And as you know, Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed in 2011 under Obama. And as you know, also now there's a partial ban of transgender in the military, but that has a totally different setup with Trump and everything. But here are a couple of the other. This was the original printing, just so that you see what it looks like. It wasn't the best paper, but this was before it went print on demand in 2000. This is the actual 1997 book, and then these are the newer books. This came out in the beginning of 1999, I'm sorry, this came out in 2002. Now, I had a little booklet called Our Fundamental Rights, which came out at the end of 1998, which I didn't bring today. This is the second book called Do Ask, Do Tell When Liberty is Stressed. And it talks a lot about the changes in the world after 9/11. That was what motivated it. It was published at the end of 2002. And then this is the newest one. This is a hardcover copy of it, published at the beginning of 2014, which is speech is a fundamental right, being listened to is a privilege, which is a major theme. It's a little bit like, it sounds like a meme a little bit, the phrase. It's a little bit like the skin in the game meme or phrase that NASA Nicholas Taleb invented, wrote a book in 2018. Some of the ideas are kind of similar, but this was early 2014, at the end of February. What happened right after this came out, and Obama was still president, things started to change. We started having the problems in Syria. We pulled out of Iraq. We started developing the refugee crisis, and we started having more racial tension with Ferguson, and society started getting more and more polarized. We had incidents before, like in 2013 in the Boston Marathon and everything, but there were more incidents in 2015. But at home, society was getting more polarized, and you all know what happened in 2016, that we gradually badly miscalculated the electoral college politics, and that disillusioned workers, white working class workers in the middle of America, kind of carried the say and were promised a lot of things, of course, that Trump couldn't deliver. But his anti-intellectual idea that they were being asked to make sacrifices for the elites. The Democrats had become the elites, weren't the working class anymore. You all know what happened in 2016, and that the Russians and foreign adversaries helped drive the polarization, people into echo chambers and social media with all kinds of fake sites and bots and so forth. So we've gotten away from search engines, people finding information with search engines, which is what I depended on for this to work. And this had worked pretty well, into the middle of the last, as you got into the 2005, 2006 period, 2007. Then it started to change with social media. And then the bots and the algorithms started taking over. So the other thing that the internet depended on, and let's go back to this one. The other thing that it depended on was the safe harbor the Digital Millennium Copyright Act in 1998. And you all know, and that was what protected a social media site or any platform from being sued for copyright infringement committed by a user if it took down a notice when there was a complaint, and then the content creator could appeal and could challenge it. But at least taking it down immediately is what protected the platform from a copyright liability. Well, that's been undermined too. It's been abused by trolls and all kinds of things, but that's been undermined. But those are the two foundations of why we've gotten used to the idea that you can say anything you want and other people will find it without having to have a gatekeeper or without anybody having to approve what you say before it goes out. And we've gotten to count on that. We have a whole generation of people that counts on that. And that could change, and I'm going to go into how that's likely to change pretty soon. Let's run down what through some of the threats are. Well, so we talked about the first two, which were taken care of, the Communications Decency Act. Then the Child Online Protection Act of 1998. I was a litigant, a sub-plaintiff with that. That basically proposed that that every website had to have an age gate to make sure that minors weren't seeing content only suitable for adults. And what that meant was a little bit vague. Was it only commercial sites, or could it be any site that might become commercial in the future, like mine? Because I was selling books, that meant that I was commercial. And that was struck down in 2007. It was too much like the original CDA. It basically, there wasn't any way to tell exactly what the provisions about the wording meant. So that was struck down in 2007 after several rounds through the Supreme Court. Then there were some of the other problems. After 9/11, there was concern that ordinary individual websites could be hacked by terrorists to plant steganographic instructions for other attacks. That's something you never heard about very much, and it kind of died off, was never talked about. But that was a concern we had for a little while. Then there was the problem, another problem you didn't hear about, the implicit content problem. A person could post something that provokes someone else to do something and provokes some other kind of incident, and the speech itself might be innocuous, might be perfectly legal, but the intention of the person in posting it might be an issue anyway. In other words, the person's motives for posting it to provoke others into action, even though there's normally a legal doctrine of, immediate lawless action or something. That's always been a problem that you haven't heard people talk about very much. In 2008, there was some talk that people would have to have media perils insurance, which somebody like me who didn't have income to pay for it, that would have shut me down right away if anybody had ever done that. But the plans that were thought about, the insurance plans, were not very good. They had actually tried offering them with the National Writers Union back in 2001, and that never went anywhere. In fact, I was turned down on my renewal because I dealt with gay and lesbian content. So you can imagine how that would have turned out. Fortunately, there was a big distraction. The financial crisis of 2008 distracted everybody enough that nobody thought about this again very much for 10 years. But it could come back as an idea. Another problem we had was copyright trolls, bloggers getting sued. People would buy the copyrights for newspapers. A company called Right Haven went around buying up copyrights for newspaper stories and photos and so forth, and then suing bloggers for reproducing them in their own blogs without permission. And many of the suits were very frivolous, and bloggers couldn't afford to defend themselves. Unfortunately, the Electronic Frontier Foundation and a number of other nonprofits did a lot of pro bono work and got Brighthaven pretty much shut down. Finally, a few courts turned them down because their suits, they were repeatedly making frivolous suit claims all the time. You can sometimes, with copyright, be required to pay, if you file a frivolous suit, a court can order you to pay the defendant's cost. That doesn't happen very often, but they were starting to do that, as I remember, with Right Haven, and that kind of shut Right Haven down. So then we stopped after 2013, we stopped hearing about that. In 2013 and 2014, we started hearing more concern about foreign hacking of websites. Partly some of it was radical Muslim extremism. And today it could be extremism, domestic extremism. That wasn't so much a worry then. There was a big hack. There was also North Korea was involved. As you remember, North Korea hacked Sony at the end of 2014 because of the movie The Interview about Kim Jong-un. And you can imagine if this happened 5 years ago, how much tension there is now with North Korea. Okay, but so that was a big concern. In 2016, of course, we know that the whole thing about bots and fake news and algorithms and people being driven to the echo chambers and people without a lot of education and people who weren't real literate and really didn't know how to use search engines because they hadn't had to. They were being fed their content by algorithms by Facebook and so forth. We all know what happened in 2016. Whether the social media companies caused Hillary Clinton to lose, that's debatable. The answer is probably not. The email thing was more serious than I think a lot of people realized. I'm an IT person. I know how you can screw up when you're working in information technology. I've seen scandals in my own work or problems and issues in my own workplaces back when I was working for regular companies that could have blown up and been very serious. And Hillary's bad judgment was similar to bad judgment I've had myself on the job 20 or 30 years ago. I mean, I can think of things where I did things wrong that I shouldn't have done, but worse things could have happened than did. Well, and she had just very bad judgment in the way she managed this, and she might have won if if this hadn't happened. And then there's the odd thing about Anthony Weiner. Why in the world were her emails on a laptop that belonged to Anthony Weiner's wife? You know, why did this all even happen? It's just bizarre. And then James Comey bringing it up right before the election. Remember all that? It might have changed things. You know, it makes me think of my own workplace and some incidents in my own life. And there's kind of a bizarre parallel between some of this and some things that have happened in my own life. We don't have time to get into the detail right now. But to me, it was deja vu. I was seeing the same things I had seen earlier in my life come back and bite other people, in this case Hillary Clinton. Okay, now we start getting to the list of the real issues. The repeal of network neutrality when Ajit Pai took over, you know, the FCC. Repeal of the formal network neutrality legislation that Barack Obama had implemented. Remember all that. It took a while, and it took a vote, and then by the middle of 2018, the repeal had taken taken place completely by June of 2018. But it hasn't affected anything except some isolated issues with a few, well, it's affected emergency operations one time, but it hasn't affected ordinary websites. Ordinary websites, even like mine, have not been expected to pay telecom companies for their sites to be accessed, which was feared. Well, it hadn't happened before Obama's regulations, so why was it going to happen now? This really hasn't turned out to be a big issue. What could happen, and we talked about this the last time I was here, what could happen is that the telecom providers could require everybody to have HTTPS. And then there are other technologies, not just virtual private network, but there's secure DNS coming along too, which is another technology for accessing websites more securely. They could start requiring people to get into that at some point if they're going to be accessed. That's a possible complication, but it hasn't happened yet. Everybody said the sky would fall if we lost network neutrality, and there were groups like Fight for the Future organizing demonstrations and sending out bombastic emails asking you to donate and join them and go protest and carry things with them and so forth over this one issue. And the problem is, although they may have thought that they shouldn't give any ground on this one issue, and there were people who did think that network neutrality was the only issue in town, well, the sky didn't fall after it was repealed, and then there were a lot more problems that would follow that would be a lot more serious than network neutrality. And that's one of the biggest points I want to make in my session today, is that a lot of times that the things you think are the biggest problems, and if you organize demonstrations and protests over, which my friend Ford Fisher will go out and film, and then which YouTube will demonetize when he films it, that's another thing. But the whole protest thing, News to Share is a great channel. Let me just say that he has an incredible library of stuff to watch. But I went to one of the protests in December of 2014 and filmed it myself and so forth, and people thought the sky was falling and everything. But it didn't. Some other things started coming along that were much more serious. Pretty soon we started hearing about the Cambridge Analytica scandal with Facebook. And that is a little bit similar to some other problems now that you have with YouTube and COPPA, which is not COPA. COPA was the Child Online Protection Act. COPPA is the Child Online Personal Privacy Protection Act, which we'll come back and talk about in a few minutes. Totally different law. But there's some similar underlying concepts having to do with age gating that we'll come back and talk about in a minute. But FOSTA, I can't remember, and SESTA was the other thing. Let's just write this down on this sheet of paper and write it down in red. I'll write it down in orange. Orange man bad. FOSTA, SESTA. In the Senate it was called SESTA. And in the House, it was called FOSTA. And the legislation got much worse in the last month or so before it passed, with some rounds going back and forth. Not only was sex trafficking, was knowingly facilitating sex trafficking, was a platform going to not have Section 230 protection if a platform knew about sex trafficking, which to make anything a knowingly provision in the law is highly dubious to start with, because that's in this case, that's a reason not to look, not to monitor anything. So it's very dubious to word a law like that way. In the Senate it was called SESTA. But they added normal prostitution, just trying to run prostitution, a normal like around Logan Circle in Washington or something. The problem being that the Congress was fed the idea that most prostitution rings lead to sex trafficking overseas, which I doubt is true. But so they included a lot of other things, and so when FOSTA was signed into law in April 2018, a lot of websites shut down, adult, sex services and so forth. That all came about because of Backpage, as you remember, that one company that hid the fact it was selling, essentially seemed to be trying to sell ads. And if you may remember, Customs or the federal government, the Department of Justice or Customs or somebody seized Backpage as a site. And when you go to the site, you actually see the seizure notice from the federal government on the front page. I don't know if that would work if I tried to do it here, but you can try that at home. But that was a major breach in Section 230, the FOSTA law. Then, in the summer of 2018, right after the GDPR, which is the General Data Protection Regulations in Europe, which required a little bit more privacy notification by websites and everything, was passed. When the GDPR, we started hearing about the European Union Copyright Directive, particularly the Articles 13, I think it was Articles 11 and 13, which became 15 and 17 later. Article 11 was a link tax, which meant that if you linked to a story from a regular newspaper, you had to pay the newspaper to even link to their story in Europe. That doesn't happen in the United States, but in Europe they were trying to force people, bloggers, to pay for the right to even link to a story in a European paper. And then Article 13, of course, was the thing that essentially required platforms, especially YouTube, to screen all the content before it was uploaded. They didn't want to have a takedown. They didn't want to have a safe harbor. They didn't want the content to even upload anyway. To put it very bluntly, in Europe there was an attitude among the corporate elite and among Axel Voss was the guy in Germany who promoted it, that people didn't have any business being in publishing unless they were professional journalists and if they were legitimate companies. He wanted to shut all this down. To be very blunt, in other words, everything I talked about by putting this stuff online, that would have to be, even text would have to be screened. Now, that passed after various iterations. That passed the European Parliament, I think early in 2019. I don't remember the exact dates. And now the EU has to go through the process of making each of the 28 member countries in Europe pass a law that conforms to the copyright directive. I haven't actually checked to see how far they've gotten. I think France has passed the law so far. I haven't been hearing a lot about it lately because there's so many other problems. But I'm going to check pretty soon and see what's exactly going on. Susan Wojcicki at YouTube said, what she said was, we would probably in Europe have to stop letting ordinary people upload what they want, and we would probably have to pre-approve anybody. People would have to apply to publish on YouTube, and we would have to scan them. Probably they wouldn't be able to do it unless their operation actually made money and unless they had actual subscribers. So essentially, everything would have to be monetizable, not necessarily with ads, but with people actually subscribing. That's probably what's going to happen in Europe, I guess. Now, if that's going to be the paradigm in Europe, it would be very easy to imagine that the same thing could gradually happen here, because right now, I guess they're going to have to block content from the United States because it hasn't been screened this way from reaching Europe. Now, I haven't noticed on YouTube, much European content being blocked yet. I still can find classical music from Europe and things that you would think of would be very copyrighted protection. I'm still finding it now, but but I am going to start checking pretty soon to see how that's going. Then in late 2018, there were major deplatformings of conservative speakers. And this is the crowd you probably hear about a lot: Milo Yiannopoulos, Paul Joseph Watson, Laura Loomer, and so forth, Sargana Bakad. Some people had accounts on Patreon, and the accounts were suddenly terminated because somebody complained. A social justice warrior would complain. And and the stories that they would come up with would be sort of probably partially true, but easily misinterpreted. It wasn't clear. People were accused of being white supremacists when they weren't. But if you associated with other people, or if you were seen in the company, I know Milo was banned by Patreon immediately because he had been to a Proud Boys event. Well, if you're going to ban somebody just because he went to an event, I mean, just for hanging around other people or something, that's very scary. And then there were a few cases where banks closed accounts with a few of these people, so there was accusations of collusion between the far left, the social justice warriors, and some of the tech companies. The left, for example, will tend to threaten boycotts. Conservatives generally don't do that, but one of the reasons that the anti-gun movement has been effective is, the attack on the NRA has been so effective, is various retailers and so forth have been threatened with boycotts. And some retailers have pulled guns, as you know, from their stores and so forth, stopped selling a lot of it. And a lot of websites have stopped selling a lot of it. So David Hogg and the entire March for Our Lives has been fairly effective in drawing attention to the problems. And yes, there were political contributions that the NRA was getting and everything. There's a terrible problem, but the whole gun issue brings up the question that who takes the risks, and I'll get back to this list in a minute, but yes, it's far too easy to get a gun, and so there's far too much chance that somebody who is demented will get a hold of a weapon and then use it in a shopping mall or a school, or you can think of almost any number of places. There's far greater risk that might happen to an ordinary person randomly than there should be. On the other hand, and so it certainly makes sense to have the full background checks and to close all the loopholes and everything. I'm all for that. On the other hand, there are people who have a legitimate need for self-defense. And in some parts of the country, they may be at more risk. And then you can also argue, if nobody has a weapon or knows how to use them, and then a real enemy comes, a real terrorist comes, like what's happening in France in 2015, people won't know how to protect themselves. So no matter what your solution is to that issue, and I'm very sympathetic to David and the initiatives these kids have had in drawing attention is tremendous. What they've achieved is tremendous. But as a matter of principle, no matter what public policy solution you have for it, you're going to put you're going to add the risk that some people have to face in order to reduce the risk that other people have to face. Just like it sounds like talking about student deferments in the draft, 50 years ago. Who should be expected to take the risks? And that's a serious moral question. And it's something we've forgotten how to talk about. Jordan Peterson, when he says, fix your own life first, well, that works when you're talking about your people you normally are dealing with in everyday life, your boss, your friends, your relationships and everything. But when something comes into your life that you don't know about, that you didn't choose to have to deal with, it doesn't help you. You have to be prepared for things. And you have to sometimes be able to work with other people, or be organized, or be prepared to protest or something. Sometimes things are not that simple. So this whole idea of personal responsibility, who is the gun owner, is the person who fired the weapon the only person who's responsible, or is the person who, you know, who radicalized somebody maybe online 2 years before partly responsible? And is the company that supported the radicalization with its business model, maybe Facebook or YouTube, do they share in moral responsibility? We have a very fundamental question here. I don't think we don't have an answer for that. We don't even have a very good way to resolve it. It's your basic belief. Libertarians believe that people should be responsible only for their own acts. Generally, religious people tend to believe that people should be responsible for their effect on a community around them, and even other communities in a much more communal sense. And so we don't know how to deal with that. But let me go on to the rest of the list. What happened, there was also, at the end of 2018, Trump was threatening to issue an executive order declaring a national emergency. Now, this was only at the southern border, and this had to do with the government shutdown last winter, and a lot of people were going without paychecks and everything. But you can shut down the internet, or you can shut down social media sites or personal websites or something in a national emergency. And I've wondered if there's a threat that something like that could happen, if Trump could lose his temper and this impeachment, you know, the mess that we have right now with the impeachment, which was very poorly handled, I think. Nobody asked me, but I think it was not, the procedure in the House was not thorough enough. And we could be facing something like that 2 weeks from now, you know, when the trials, or whenever the trial starts or something. I don't know. A president can do that. No one is really, there was an Atlantic article in January of 2019 that talked about it, that not many people have paid attention to. But yes, it's a possibility. And people have, so again, as I said before, network neutrality isn't everything. There are all these other things that are happening